Welcome everyone. It's just gone 3 o'clock in Queensland, so we'll start the webinar now, and I'm sure we'll have a few people join as the hour goes on if people have to come and go on a Friday afternoon. But just a bit of housekeeping as we get started, just letting you know that this webinar will be recorded and it will be available to view on the MLA website at a later date if you need to have a look at it, or if you'd like to share it with anyone else. As we go along, please put your questions into the chat function and we'll pick up those questions either at the appropriate time throughout the discussions or at the end of things. So, and if we do run out of time, we'll certainly get back to you after the meeting. So just to begin proceedings, Edwina Close from the MLA team is going to give a bit of an introduction as to why we're here, and then throw over to some of our guest speakers. Over to you, Edwina.
Thanks, Brad. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. We feel it really important just to sort of set up this industry forum to sort of report back on COP28 and what happened over there. So as you probably know, the conferences parties, or COPs as they're known, are the really important global sort of gatherings of world leaders to progress climate change commitments globally. With last year's this year's COP28 being held in Dubai in the UAE. Of course, COP21 was probably the most significant conference where parties sort of signed the Paris Agreement, which you would have heard of, I'm sure. The first global agreement and legally binding international treaty that made a commitment to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels to achieve our climate neutrality commitment by 2050. So the Paris Agreement remains really the compass, but there's been a number of discussions and commitments and progress to support that, including the climate mitigation and adaptation commitments, the provision of the Loss and Damages Fund to support those developing countries that clearly bear the immediate and very real impacts of climate change. The first global stocktake or 5-year report back on progress made by countries to achieve the Paris Agreement, and significantly at COP28 acknowledgement, I guess, for the first time of food, of agriculture being a really important part of the climate solution. So MLA sort of had the opportunity sort of last year on behalf of industry to attend COP27 that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt as part of the Australian government overflow badge provision. So the government has, of course, official delegation to the COP consisting of Australian government officials, but beyond that official delegation, they've also got the provision or the option of allowing additional participants to come through the overflow party badge provision. Of course, overflow participants are not allowed to be part of the official delegation, and they're not in any way authorised to speak on behalf of Australia, but they do form part of these side events, which enables countries and industries to support their governments and like-minded international and national constituents to really profile the importance of our industries and our leadership and positive progress and impacts. So again, MLA had the opportunity to work with the Australian government and DAF this year, and we were allocated 4 badges, those badges being allocated to our CN30 project manager, Julia Waite, to our regional manager, EU and Middle East and North Africa, Scott Walker, to Dr. Stuart Denham, Principal Scientist with CSIRO, and Naomi Wilson, our Head of Sustainability and Environment at AACO. So really 4 key stakeholders that were able to really speak on terms of our positive impact and progress in terms of the livestock industry at COP. And again, the number of speaking opportunities significantly increased this year from 1 speaking event last year to up to 8, I think it was this year. Again, working with the Australian government, the International Meat Secretariat, the North American Meat Institute, the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and the Global Meat Alliance to make some demonstration of significant sort of discussions and input into panels and presentations to really tell our sustainability story and also the progress we've made in terms of CN30. So that's probably about enough from me as an introduction. I'm sure you're really keen to hear from everybody on the ground at COP28. So without further ado, I'll cross to Scott Walker. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Edwina, and welcome everybody to the call. It's wonderful to be on here. As you can see from your screen, we've got a few photos from some of the events on the ground, and I'll go into a bit more detail and a few facts on COP and tell you a little bit about what MLA does in the markets as well before we throw over to our subject matter experts. So, you know, for me, I recently started in the EMEA position for Meat and Livestock Australia the second half of this year, having run the markets in Japan and Korea for a number of years. We have a dedicated team on the ground in Dubai that services the region, and we focus on international business development and marketing in general. So I cover the region from UK to Europe, where we have offices established now in UK, Saudi, and UAE. So we have that physical presence on the ground, and we also have local Arabic-speaking staff. So we're really able to service the market quite well. So our role encompasses B2B business development activities as well as marketing promotion, and we essentially grow the presence and preference for Australian red meat in the region, and it is an incredibly competitive region for other countries of origins. So activities cover a broad scope of engagements with education, butchery trainings, retail sampling and promotion, consumer campaigns, consumer-facing social media, and probably most notably, we have a significant presence at Gulf Food and a very large number of companies that come up from Australia to attend that event. We're in preparations for the new year. This is an annual event. It's probably one of our largest trade shows globally, and we get customers from all over the world attending that. So that's one of our key activities. I just wanted to offer to all of you for more information. If you do want to know what we're doing in the markets, please reach out to me directly or our regional managers in any of our markets. And be sure to follow us on social media where you can see exactly what we're doing on the ground, exactly how we present to the customer. So getting into COP. So our involvement at COP was really to help facilitate a little bit of logistics and participate in some of these side events and discussions. As you're going to hear, this was the largest COP in history. The first COP, I think, was in 1995. There was about 4,000 people. There's over 100,000 people that attended COP this year. So the interest level and the engagement is significant. A few stats from Australia. So in addition to that 100,000, there was 3 Australian government ministers that attended, 4 ministerial staff and 41 officials. So there's 48 members in the Australian government COP28 official delegation. There were 60 plus events held in the Australian pavilion in the blue zone area, which was the closed area. And there was over 300 overflow badges issued under the Australian banner, including 30 plus representatives identifying as First Nations. So this is a significant number of Australians in the delegation representing a large number of industries, which is fantastic. My general impressions. Now, this is held at Expo City, so this is where the expo was, which unfortunately was during COVID. So, you know, if that was something that you like to attend, you might not have been able to. This is a very large area. It is a city within a city. So interacting with, getting involved in these side events was often a 15 to 30-minute walk between these different activities. And it was impossible to know what was going on in every booth. But what that also meant was there was a great opportunity when you were walking around to be drawn into side events, not only just as a participant in the debating sense, but sometimes even drawn onto panels. So with that large number of Australian delegates, we were able to cover a very broad range of industries, a very broad range of topics. For myself, the main panel that I sat in on was with the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and the topic of conversation was global livestock industry commitments to mitigation and adaptation at scale. While that topic was quite broad, I shared the panel with New Zealand, Canada, and Brazil. And we were able to bring the conversation into a number of different areas, and I was happily able to apply a bit of a consumer lens to the conversation, which isn't always easy. They're generally quite high level. So being able to bring that consumer angle gave us a different perspective. At many of these panels, we were also able to provide some collateral for our MLA Sustainability Impact Report, MLA CN30 Roadmap, and our CN30 product catalogue. So we're able to share a bit more further information for those attendees that were interested. As we're coming towards the end of COP, and I'll let our other panelists talk more in detail about MLA's presence and MLA's MLA's forum itself. I just wanted to mention that there was also a lot of periphery events. One of those was the Dubai Food Safety Conference, which is a significant annual conference. And because it was directly on the back of COP, they stuck with the theme of climate change, sustainability, and the impact of climate change on food safety. And what that meant was there was a broader range of very high-level delegates, including Sue McCluskey and others, who were able to present at this forum, as well as MLA. And Julia might want to provide a bit more information about that in her presentation. So that's on the ground. It was a huge event. It seemed like it was never going to end, but it was quite amazing to be involved in it. There was definitely a buzz in the city. It's noticeably quieter in Dubai now that the 100,000 people that attended have disappeared. So that's nice as we wind down into the season's break. I'm going to throw now to Naomi Wilson. Naomi is the head of environment and sustainability at AECO, and she leads programs in sustainable beef production, including emissions efficiency and reductions and sequestration in the landscape. Naomi, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. I'm going to keep it pretty short. This COP was my first ever, and it was quite an amazing experience. It was indeed a huge event, and I can support Scott's statement about how big it was. On the first day, I clocked up just over 13 kilometres walking in between venues. So it was certainly, there was a lot to see and a lot to engage with. My formal capacity at COP was participating in an MLA DAF panel talking about the role of sustainable livestock production in food security globally, and presenting in particular on some of Australia's production systems. Other than that, I spent a fair amount of time talking with other leaders in sustainable production and nature-based solutions to climate from organisations from across the world. And that was a really fantastic opportunity that I really appreciated. COP was a great, although there were 100,000 people there, it was a great opportunity to meet individuals face-to-face and have some in-depth and meaningful discussions about the future of sustainable agriculture and our role in climate and the potential that we have. A couple of observations of COP. Generally speaking, it was, from a producer's perspective, it was great to see the recognition of food and agriculture as a part of the solution for climate change, as opposed to just focusing on the problem aspects as it has in the past. And that unlocked many conversations around what that possibility is. In my discussions around what we're doing here in Australia and some of the technologies that we're developing and the practices that we're building, some of the feedback from others globally is that the Australian livestock industry is leading the way in some of those programs, and certainly in our production processes. And in particular around efficiency of production and driving nature-based solutions to climate. It was great to hear that. Sometimes you get a little bit stuck in your own head working on these things, so to go and see it in that global context was really encouraging. The follow-on thought for that is that there are some significant opportunities for us as an industry to connect globally and to play a leading role in bringing forward some of the solutions for climate that we have within our production system, and sharing those with other countries and collaborating, in particular in areas where we have shared values and shared production context. So, you know, on the panel that I was talking with Julia and a couple of others, There were some comments from a representative from an African country and talking about a production system that's not dissimilar to the one that we at AACO have. So there's certainly opportunities for that global collaboration moving forward. And for me, that was, one of the take-home messages of this COP. I might hand to Julia, who's MLA's CN30 project manager, for some deeper insights around some of the outcomes of COP and what was discussed there.
Sure. Thanks, Naomi. Stuart and I will carry through some of the other interactions we had at the conference. So we were primarily attending a real mix of livestock, protein diversification, and also emissions in ag side events. So we got a pretty broad scope of the different conversations happening on stage. And what was quite pleasing was that we didn't encounter any blatant anti-meat rhetoric in the conversations we were attending. Instead, what we heard, even outside of a purely livestock audience, was a lot more nuance to how we're going to move forward. So livestock as a contributor to emissions, but also part of the solution. We heard repeated that there is so much difference between the way regions produce livestock, their particular demands and nutritional baselines as well. So there'll not be one solution for how we approach this, and that we do need to have balanced diets across the global north and south, and really recognizing that there is an increased demand for animal source proteins that we have an obligation to meet. So some of the things they focused on in the panels were examples of sustainable intensification of the dairy and livestock industry. How could we maintain or increase output while decreasing our natural resource inputs? Reducing supply chain waste and loss was critical, but a lot of the discussion came back to this importance of meat to nutrition globally, and in particular its role in supporting sustainable development and livelihoods in low to middle income countries. So moving away from really black and white discussions around meat in a future food world, and coming back to how do we ensure equity of access, distribution of this valuable protein to parts of the world that aren't receiving enough. So livestock very much on the agenda this year at COP, which was very, very important to the overall theme of the conference. So this year, food and agriculture and food systems were front and center of the agenda, whereas in previous years, even though that in our bubble, all very focused in ag, that seems obvious. In previous years, it's been really dominated by the energy, mining, and heavy industry sector. So great to see food and ag having a seat at the table this year. Despite the balance in discussion, we all sort of commented that there could be more visual representation of livestock at COP and in the promotional material. So that's something to reflect upon. And whilst, our experience at COP was all very pro livestock as moving forward, there were obviously voices at that conference that were voicing for a more hardline approach. And as we'll see, as we break down some of the outputs of COP, these haven't been reflected in those documents. So that's really really positive. And oftentimes the language that those more anti-meat groups were using was around restricting industrial agriculture, although it was never clear what how they actually defined industrial, and whether Australia's pasture-raised dominant systems would actually, be part of their agenda. So I'll set up the three main outputs from COP, and then Stu is going to come in with some of the juicy detail of those. So the major one that set the theme for the conference was the United Arab Emirates Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems and Climate Action. Now that has been, at my last check, although it's probably gone up, signed by 152 countries, including Australia. And so the purpose of this document is to set a really high level strategy, direction, commitment on how its signatories will approach setting policy, setting direction that relates to food systems to achieve climate mitigation or to contribute towards climate mitigation. It's non-binding. It's really I don't want to call it a values-driven statement, but it is a high-level policy directive. The second piece that was really heavily negotiated over up until the last hour of COP, and there was multiple drafts and iterations to get it into a shape that people were happy with, is called the global stocktake. And this year was the first year that a stocktake has been done. It will be done every 5 years, and it essentially is an inventory of how the global community is performing on its commitment to the Paris Agreement. Lastly, the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, released an update of its roadmap to lower emissions agriculture, and there was a particular chapter related to livestock. So they have a goal for 2030 that methane emissions from livestock have reduced by 25% compared to 2020. But they have also carried through that same really supportive messaging around focusing on sustainable intensification, improving animal health, breeding, and reducing food and waste in the system. So 3 big outputs. I might, with that, throw to Stu to carry us through some of the detail.
Okay, thanks, Julia. Yeah, I'll just go into the details and also some background. There's a lot of side events that happen even prior to COP that sort of set the tone of what's going to be discussed, and probably the one that's most relevant to our industry was the global methane pledge that was made earlier in the year. And this was also signed by Australia and sort of indicates that we will try to reduce methane emissions from our nation by 30%. And that sort of follows into some of the documents or is what is probably the targets that are defined in something like the global stocktake, where it actually explicitly has a section that outlines that there needs to be a reduction in non-CO2 gases and in particular methane emissions. And they are talking total methane emissions from the country. So that sort of puts into context why that was in the global stocktake. There were specific clauses or paragraphs in that global stocktake that specifically looked at agriculture and food, and as Julia said, there was a lot of debate as to whether food would actually get a mention in the global stocktake, and a lot of it, the initial draft wordings was around food security, but in the end, probably the most relevant clause is one around attaining a climate resilient food and agricultural production, supply and distribution of food, and increasing the sustainability of the production system. So it's a bit wordy, but it actually says that agricultural needs to be done in a way that's sustainable, but also cope within the climate change that a lot of the industry is facing. So this does mean that in 2 years' time, Australia will actually have to report back to the UNFCCC about its role, well, the policies it's putting in place to reduce these methane emissions nationally. So that's probably the one that's going to most likely impact on our industry. The other document that came out was the FAO pathways towards lower emissions in agriculture, and I think there was some important notes in that report. In particular, their modelling that they used actually suggests that methane emissions at baseline are a little bit lower than reported previously. So, you know, it shows that the sector is it's still producing emissions, but they're not quite as high as previously reported. they do have different ways to address the sustainability of livestock, and that includes front and centre. They have changes in consumption of animal source foods. Now that doesn't mean completely moving away from livestock. The wording is quite adamant that livestock is very important, not only for an efficient way of producing animal protein, but also for livelihoods in developing countries. But it also suggests that there are ways in which people can change their diets, and that will have an impact on global consumption, because they still expect quite an increase in livestock consumption from Asia and in particular Africa as it starts to develop more broadly. Definitely one of the biggest things that we can do within our system is to reduce loss within the system and waste. It takes a lot of energy to produce livestock, and so losing animals within the system and not getting them to market is impacting on our methane intensity. So we're producing methane but not actually getting the product out at the end. So any mechanisms that can make our production systems improve sort of waste will get us there as well. And of course, increases in productivity. And that's probably the biggest signal that was coming around, is that if we make our systems more productive, then our methane emissions will go down. So that is the really big lever to pull. And it's probably a bigger lever than some of the mitigation strategies, mainly because a lot of those feed additives are just not going to be available at scale, not just within Australia, but globally, to address the reduction in methane that's required. We're probably, well, globally, we need to reduce by about 30%, which is going to be really quite hard to do across the whole globe. And so there will be industries that will reduce more than other industries. And that was probably some of the bigger conversations that were had at the side panels, that there is no one size fits all solution. They have to be regional specific, industry specific, and they have to take into account that community. Well, there's a requirement that communities should not be penalised or be negatively impacted economically. So you've got to balance your strategies for methane mitigation. So other things, talking about circular bioeconomies, trying to make the system more efficient. And in particular, some of our industries might look at that in the more intensive systems. But the big benefit that our grazing system has is our extensive grazing systems on non-arable land. So we're not competing with other food sources for people in those agricultural spaces. So again, I think a good story about the livestock industry in Australia. And I think they were probably the main key points.
I'm thinking, just while we're waiting for questions to come on board, please, everybody is welcome to put some questions in the chat for the panel to respond to. But just as a general, I guess, a lot of questions as to the effort, the expense, trying to get a voice at COP and these big international forums. Can you speak to the importance of being there and representing the industry? And that's just really an open question to anybody that wants to take a stab at it, really.
Yeah, I was busy typing what I just dropped in the chat, but I think with all these things, it can be 1 in 100,000 people milling about. It is certainly overwhelming. I think if you leverage your presence right, it is very valuable. As you mentioned, Edwina, a number of events for the delegates here that were by and large very well attended, supported by major agencies. So we spoke at a full house evening event with the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, with CEOs of the Global Dairy Forum, Canadian Cattlemen's, really well attended events. The FAO's flagship event on livestock emissions, we were there. So I think moving forward the next couple of years as well will be quite important. We've had this sort of very loose, high level framework set for how livestock is part of the solution. But on both sides, both the really vested interest in animal protein and sort of the folks who were less happy with livestock's position in those documents, there will be interest to get some more refined language and pushing for targets that put, you know, some more clearer definition, both positive and negatively for our industry, into those documents, particularly around herd numbers and methane targets. So I think the next couple of years up to COP30 will be very important. Great opportunity for us to showcase our track record on that sustainable intensification, that waste reduction, that importance of nutrition. It's really important to seize the moment there, and I do think there is room for us to increase visibility of, you know, a lot of positive imagery around the red meat and livestock sector.
Yeah, I might just add to that, and as you mentioned earlier, Julia, this is just simply, you are seeing promotional videos and you are having these very big keynote speakers that are standing up and forgetting to include livestock. If you're not there, you're not part of the conversation. Yeah, absolutely, even just walking around there is an opportunity to grab some pretty key individuals and even just give them your 30-second elevator pitch. I think one of the big panels that we attended in the major plenary area, I counted more images of bread than beef. And I think that's, that just shows that we really need to be there and be part of that conversation. Otherwise, we're going to be missed.
Yeah, I think I could agree there. I think the biggest advantage of going there was the ability to connect with other livestock nations, and the messages were the same but subtly different depending on their region, because they had, different priorities for their systems. I think also from a solutions point of view, there was a lot of collaborative thinking about how globally we can accelerate some of the solutions, because there is some money being thrown into research and then trying to adapt the current solutions that are out there for everyone's regional specific production systems. And definitely Australia is going to need that. There was some conversations, particularly from the US, around probably some solutions that may not be applicable to Australia, like genetically modified organisms. But gene editing was definitely being discussed around changing pasture quality and stuff like that. So again, they're probably more high-tech solutions and a bit further off, but it was interesting to hear some of the solutions that people were putting on the table.
I guess to that point, Stuart, how do you actually see, comments from yourselves and messaging seems like that Australia really does, the Australian livestock industry really does have, clear leadership and some runs on the board here. How do you actually utilise your knowledge to collaborate to accelerate that change across other countries and those that perhaps have not got the resources that we do?
Yeah, well, there's a few big initiatives that are absolutely focused on methane. So the Global Methane Hub is a collaboration that came out of another global collaboration. It's the way these things work. But that's going to accelerate some funding. So for extensive grazing systems, a vaccine would be spectacular. And definitely there's a large amount of money internationally being put behind vaccine technology. That's still going to be a long way off, and the level of reduction that we're going to get, we don't know. So, but that's technology that I think Australia would be very interested in. We have uniqueness in our industry, particularly in that extensive grazing in the north and the quality of that pasture. That means that some of the solutions being developed in those intensive systems in Europe may not work. And so that's where globally someone may develop something in Europe, but then we can optimize it for our systems or see whether it's going to work there.
There's a couple of comments and questions in the chat. The first one, well, more of a comment, but I think one that everyone who's aware of would welcome the news that Kevin Foster has pointed out to everyone about the net zero emissions for agriculture CRC led by COP28, and MLA's been a tier 1 partner in that. So that is really exciting news, not just for livestock production, but right across the agricultural sector. So thanks, Kevin, for pointing that out. Jacob's asked a question. This might be one for you, Edwina. When does planning start for Azerbaijan?
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Jacob. I think, I guess the first point of call is now that COP28 has closed, DQ and DAF will be certainly seeking feedback as to from delegates and badges as to our response to COP28, what worked, what didn't, how we can improve upon it. So that's the first step before then going through the process of working again collaboratively across the industry and with DAF and DQ to start thinking about COP29, God forbid.
Yes, can't start too early, I think, with these things as a lesson this year. Deborah Willis has asked, was biosecurity risk high on the agenda in the context of agriculture at COP28? If any of you guys would like to tackle that one.
Look, I probably didn't go to any of the events per se, but there was definitely, I think it would sit more under climate adaptation and livestock systems within that changing climate role. So it's definitely high on that UAE declaration that our livestock, well, our agricultural systems need to be resilient within a climate adaptive landscape. So sorry, I didn't go to any of those conversations, but yeah.
I would say I only saw mention of this from the angle of ensuring animal health as a means to having a more productive, efficient herd, and then more focus on zoonotic transfer to people, particularly in smallholder farming communities where they're living in proximity to their animals. So it took more of a people focus or an emissions reduction strategy focus.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me, there was another FAO document that was launched at COP, which was the Achieving Sustainable Developmental Goals. And in that, definitely animal health and resilient animals for food security was a key lever.
I might take the opportunity to ask another question as we're waiting for more questions to come in. So just really interested in your thoughts and learnings from other countries. Was there anything new that you learned in terms of practice change, technology, science that you think, wow, we could really apply and adapt back here at home?
I'd actually echo what Julia said right at the beginning. I think Australia is leading the pack. Not a lot of other countries had examples of where producers and industry were actually doing something at this stage. Yeah.
I had a number of conversations where speaking to other organisations doing work around, in particular around understanding landscape capacity, where work that's happening here in Australia is well in advance of the work that they're doing. And so the conversation was, I guess, more from our perspective, connecting that work to some of those global resources, for example, tech opportunities coming out of Silicon Valley. So I'd support what Stuart says in that I think, the key message coming home from COP for me was that a lot of the technology and practice that we're implementing on ground here in Australia is world leading, and there are significant opportunities for us to share that to achieve better outcomes globally.
I thought, and it was only one example out of California, but the example of local incentive schemes for greenhouse gas emission reduction on dairy farms or livestock farms was interesting. So just a state-based program where farmers could access, or they had a scheme in place to reward people who adopted a biogas fermenter, for example, and they were paid out for the volume of gas that their system trapped. And I thought that was interesting, given some of the discussion around our national scheme. What opportunities are there on a more localized or industry to industry or region based incentive scheme? And I might touch on Margaret's question in the chat. Not a real strong presence of technology startups in the events. There were some from the plant protein and the cell cultured space, people working in ESG related platforms. But I think that was probably a function of within the city that was COP. One city was called the Blue Zone for delegates only. And then there was another almost as big city called the Green Zone, which was open to the public. And that was functioning a lot more like a trade show where people, universities with some novel technology or a startup were present. So it could be to do with the city divide that we had there.
I might just make a comment, which is kind of in between a little bit of all of that. Just an observation, as there was a heavy energy focus, a lot of the exhibitors were talking about their renewable energy solutions. And as far as it goes in this region, the advancements that they're making are quite significant. Now, whether that's to make their cities renewable, focused on renewable energy, or whether that's to use renewable energy to produce fossil fuels that they on-sell, whatever it might be, it's quite a hub of activity in this region where looking for those new technologies in renewable energy. That was a key focus in many of the side exhibitors and their sort of individual country houses.
We have 2 questions from Caitlin Lubke from Cattle Australia in the chat. Thanks, Caitlin. First one, what is the overall response reaction around CN30 and Australia's sustainability initiatives when you guys were speaking to other delegates? Is it still seen as an ambitious target?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably behind why we were invited to speak at so many side events. The other sort of similar groups to us, Canada and then the US, have variations on that goal, climate and or different timelines. So I think they were very interested in what we've done, the progress from our baseline year, and we're encouraged that we acknowledge that we need to reduce direct emissions over the next 5 years as well.
And this next one might have been covered already in your response to Margaret's comment in the chat, but what was the most promising science innovation coming out of other countries around emissions reduction, mitigation, and carbon storage that could be applied in Australia?
You see anything, Stu? Yeah.
I'm going to say, I think the global collaboration, particularly focused around, so there's an accelerator fund that has been set up with about $20 million put into it. And there's a genetic component to it, which mirrors what's in the CN30 initiative. There's the big ticket item in that one, though, is the vaccine development, and bringing people with really good capability in that immune response field to look at this problem. There's some work around, or there's a lot of talk now about how do we manipulate the rumen for productivity. So if we are going to inhibit methane, how do we capture that energy loss? And so there's going to be a bit of a focus around that at the moment, but there's not really any silver bullet sitting out there at the moment. And I think, again, any of these technologies are probably a little way off. So some of these other levers around reducing waste within the system, improving nutrient to the animal, and these are not simple things to do in our system, but that's what we can do now to at least improve our intensity calculations.
And a lot coming out for more global south context that, you know,
Yep.
either we'd already be doing or it wouldn't, it's not that the issue it's solving isn't a particular problem here, like around, you know, human grade edible foodstuffs being fed to livestock. I think a very small proportion of our feed stuff falls into that category. So yeah, I think the attention will be a lot more on that kind of production system, which I think is good to keep in mind that by and large we'll be expected to invest in R&D for the top end of town, which Australia is, given that there's parts of the world who don't have the mechanisms we do to invest in R&D in this space. So.
It appears we've exhausted all the questions, so thank you for sending those in. But I might pass over to you, Edwina, if you have any closing remarks or if you wanted to wrap up the meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I thought it might be just good to ask the panel just their final reflections, I guess, the key take-homes they came back from COP28 with before we wrap up. We might as well take advantage of the time, a couple more minutes. Julia, perhaps to you first.
Edwina. Rude. I was just trying to reflect upon what those are. I think for me, it was really heartening that and perhaps what we're led to believe, which is that there is, you know, a real entrenched anti-meat rhetoric wasn't strong, even in some of the countries that you'd expect it to be. I attended talks from the Danish delegates, and the value and the essential contribution of livestock was there. So I think that was really heartening for me, and that's just given direction for us to focus on those stories of, you know, how we're continuously improving across a range of environmental credentials, how we can reduce waste, and we can connect what we're doing to contributing to global nutrition causes, then that's, I think, really fantastic and what we should focus on.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Julia there. I think it was quite heartening to hear that there wasn't a lot of people out there attacking livestock industry. It was seen as critically important for the globe. I think also the importance of how our livestock are raised. It's quite efficient in the way we use our landscape, and there's challenges for us. You know, this is a hard to abate industry. There are challenges, but quite heartened by the collaborative international nature that everyone sees this as a problem globally that we've got to deal with. And so there's a lot of willingness to collaborate and share results and be transparent in what we're trying to achieve.
I might go next. I think again, it was definitely encouraging to see the focus on agriculture and food, livestock as part of the solution. Seeing the recognition and the value of food and our contribution to securing a food supply globally really came through strongly at COP, and balancing that with the emissions that are associated with that and how we can find solutions on that collaboratively, I think is probably the underlying message I've been home with.
I think for me, the general atmosphere that we're not just going to drill down into the negativity of a problem, but we're actually going to try to work towards finding some kind of solution. I think that it was going a bit beyond a talk fest. So I was quite impressed. Like I left feeling, heartened. I think that these kinds of events being held in a major city like Dubai that's able to handle 100,000 people relatively easily sets this kind of COP apart from something like Sharm el Sheikh, where you might not get that same level of engagement because it's too hard to move around or there's too many private jets flying into a tiny airport. I think that Baku will be somewhere in between next year, but I think you'll still find that it's extremely well attended, and that the size of that attendance is just indicative of how important most countries feel this topic is. So yeah, so I'm really optimistic about the future and our and I guess what will be, I see increasing engagement from our industry in these forums and with other countries on these important topics.
Thank you. I just want to really reinforce the thank you to Scott, to Naomi, to Stuart, and to Julia. It takes considerable effort to attend these events and a lot of preparation, and it takes considerable costs. So I really appreciate you putting your hand up and putting the time and effort and commitment into this. I think going from COP27 last year to 2 delegates and 1 panel presentation to 4 delegates and numerous presentations this year, really we have cemented a really strong relationship with DAF and with international and national constituents. And I think the Australian livestock industry is certainly recognised for its leadership in progressing these positive commitments and to climate change. So thank you so much for your commitment and your support, and to all those that sat in on this seminar today, this webinar today. Really appreciate you taking the time and attention for this as well. So thank you. Across to you, Brad.
Well, that's the conclusion of the webinar. Thanks for attending. And as I said, it'll be available as a recording. So have a good afternoon, weekend, everyone. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.